Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking about why the space shuttle was so unreliable. We will be talking about the SRBs or solid rocket boosters, to the thermal protection system, and many other components of the vehicle. You will learn about what the space shuttle is, why they even chose that design, and what made it so dangerous. So before we get any further, let's get right into the video. The Space Shuttle was a two-stage launch vehicle. It was made up of three parts. The first being the large external fuel tank, which is also called the main fuel tank, because it is the main fuel tank. The main tank was painted in white for the first two launches of the shuttle, but the NASA realized they could save over half a ton of weight if they didn't paint it. So that is how the orange tank got its orange color that everyone knows to this day. The main fuel tank housed two different tanks, the tanks for liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. The liquid oxygen or LOX tank was on the top of the tank, which was also the nose of the tank. The nose cone also had a gaseous oxygen vent, /valve, /fairing, /nose cone, / a lot of other things. On the bottom of the LOX tank there is an anti-slosh baffle, which does what it stands for. It prevents the fuel from sloshing around the tank. Then under the LOX tank there is a little open space for pipes and all those things. Then under the gap there is a little liquid hydrogen tank. Well, it's not so little. The liquid hydrogen tank was filled up with liquid hydrogen during the launch. There were internal stringers for the fuel not to slosh around during the launch as well. Then on the side of the main tank, there were SRB strap-on points, which are meant for the SRBs to be strapped onto. Then there was the aft attachment point for the orbiter. That is where the fuel is pushed through during the launch. Then up to the nose cone, there is another attachment point for the orbiter. So now that we have a main overview of the external fuel tank, let's talk about the SRBs. The strap-on SRBs, or solid rocket boosters, are made up of solid fuel. Their propellant is in a solid state, that is why it's called a solid rocket booster. They were both reused, but it was more refurbishable as the whole inside was taken out and only the outside shell was reused. The boosters popped parachutes once they were low enough to slow down to make a soft touchdown in the water off the coast of Cape Canaveral. A team of 16 people would go for each booster, and that's 32 people just to get the booster on the boat. So that's all there is to talk about the SRBs for the overview. Now let's talk about the main part of the launch vehicle, the orbiter. The orbiter is the main part of the vehicle. It has three liquid-fueled RS-25 engines, which are also known as the main engines. The RS-25 engines are also going to be used on the Artemis core stage, but I will talk about that in another video. The orbiter is also called the OBV, or Orbital, or Orbiter Vehicle. Aside from its three main engines, it also had two other OMS engines, or AJ-10-190 engines. The AJ-10-190 engines were also called the OMS, that stands for Orbital Maneuvering System. They were made to make the final orbit insertion for the space shuttle. They were extremely reliable and has never failed in its 30-year lifespan. The OBV had a tail fin which flaps on it to control the direction it's pointed. Then it has two very large wings on the side of the vehicle which provided lift during re-entry and the landing sequence. The wings were not normal wings though. They started up at the crew compartment by the nose and then ended all the way down by the engines. The orbiter alone had a wingspan of 78 feet across from the tip of the wing to the tip of the other wing. It was also 122 feet long, or tall, depending on whether you think of it on the rocket or after it landed. The orbiter would also have a large heat shield on the windward side of the vehicle. That is because it would have to go through the heat of re-entry, which can get as hot as 3,200 degrees Kelvin or 2,900 degrees Celsius. That's very hot. That is why the vehicle has around 23,000 heat shield tiles. NASA released that each tile is around $24 to manufacture, which comes out at around $552,000 without the labor fee and all those other variables. And there were also 6 orbiter vehicles, so the total price for the heat shield would be roughly $3,312,000. That's something very expensive, which would be replaced almost halfway in between each flight. So now that we have an overview of the orbiter, let's talk about the whole vehicle. The space shuttle is 184 feet tall and vertical on the launch pad with all of its parts connected. The main parts include the orbiter, the external fuel tank, and the side SRBs. All those components are critical in the launch vehicle getting into orbit. The weight of the vehicle at liftoff is 4.5 million pounds, which is just crazy how NASA can get that thing to fly in the air. The crazy thing is that without fuel, the space shuttle only weighed 613,000 pounds. But we'll get to the weight later in the video. So now you know why the space shuttle is with its main components, and let's talk about the construction and training process. The construction of the space shuttle was made up of many steps. First, let's talk about how the external tank was built. The large external tank was first built by stacking internal rings for the tanks. Once they have built the LOX and hydrogen tank, they'll begin the large external cryoshell. The cryoshell is the orange tank that you see on the outside, but on the inside there are many more components than you might think. The main components are the LH2, or liquid hydrogen tank, and the liquid oxygen tank. There's the inner tank, which houses liquid nitrogen, computer hardware, vents, valves, sensors, the termination system, and many more components. Let's first talk about the LOX fuel tank. On the top there's a small LOX vent / valve which released the pressure from the cryogenic liquids and fumes in the tank. Then under the LOX tank on its walls were slosh baffles, which prevented the fuel from sloshing around. Then under that was the inner tank, which housed the liquid nitrogen for the RCS system. Then just a bit farther under there was the liquid hydrogen tank. It was at the bottom, so there was no need for an anti-slosh mechanism, so they removed it. The flight termination system was in the center of the fuel tank. The FTS was just there for range safety, so no planes or other small vehicles would be damaged. There are other components of the external fuel tank, but those are all the main components that you need to know about. There are thousands more components, but if you want a dive into those, you can comment below. So now we will talk about how the SRBs were manufactured. The space shuttle's SRBs were built and designed by Morton Thiokol. There were two different versions of the SRB, V1 and V2. They used V1 until the Challenger disaster in 1986. The disaster held the space shuttle program for around 3 years and made Morton Thiokol redesign the SRB. And that is when they began using SRB V2. The first launch of SRB V2 was STS-26, which was successful. NASA used the V2 SRB for the rest of the shuttle program until the vehicle was retired in late 2011. At the bottom there was the aft skirt, which housed the engine bell and nozzle. Attached to the skirt there were 4 hold-down posts which held down the vehicle while it was on the launch pad. Then above that there was the aft segment which housed the nozzle and some solid propellant. Then above that there was another aft segment, which was then followed by 2 forward segments. Those 3 segments were purely just full of solid propellant. Then there was the forward skirt, which contained the recovery beacon, the camera pod, the flight computer, the avionics, and much more. Then there was a nose cone, which was used for maintaining aerodynamic stability during its flight and for protecting the 3 main parachutes. Then the nose cone tip housed the pilot and drogue chutes. For the recovery, the pilot chute would be the first to deploy, then it would be followed by a single drogue chute to slow the booster down, and then after that the nose tip would pop off and the 3 main chutes would deploy and then slowly expand. Its speed would soon drop to just down to 19 miles per hour, and then it would splash down in the ocean shortly after. The orbiter vehicle is by far the most complicated part of the space shuttle. It contained the crew cabin, the heat shield, the wings, the main engines, the payload, and a lot of other essentials for the mission, which means that it had to be very, very over-engineered. Let us begin with talking about the main engines. The main engines were placed at the back end of the orbiter vehicle. They were RS-25 engines, which were high thrust and very efficient engines. The RS-25 ran on liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. There were 3 engines. They burned the whole way to orbit, and they burned for an impressive 8 minutes and 30 seconds. It is the only engine to burn for that long duration and successfully get into orbit. That is also why the Artemis program will use the RS-25 engines, and it will burn for 8 minutes on the core stage to help the Orion spacecraft to get into orbit. The engines were able to gimbal, which could change the pitch, yaw, and roll of the vehicle. So now that we have an overview of the engines, we can now talk about the payload bay and wings. The wings were very large. They would start up by the crew cabin, then they would end down by the wings. The wing at the front was small, and then it grew until it was fully expanded once it reached the tail. There was also a tail fin, which had ailerons and housed a drag chute for the landing phase. It also contained air brakes, where the tail flaps would spit out in would split in two to create drag and slow the spacecraft down. The payload bay was 60 feet by 15 feet. It was very big and could bring lots of things into orbit, such as space station modules, which only the space shuttle could carry. The inside of the payload bay doors had solar panels on them to capture the sunlight, which could then transfer into electricity and then power the shuttle. The payload bay was only open when they were in orbit, so when they were on the launch pad, they could be powered by the tower. There was a docking port in the payload bay, so when they docked with the International Space Station, they could dock. But there was also an airlock on some missions for missions that didn't dock with the space station, so that they could have EVA, or extravehicular activity, and without losing all their oxygen in the cabin. The training consisted of many different processes and systems. The astronauts were trained to escape from the vehicle and get away from the launch tower by a very cool method. There were many baskets on the side of LP-39A and B, which could let the astronauts aboard from a failing rocket. The astronauts would get into the baskets with maybe 2 to 3 people in each basket. Then they would release the basket. The basket would then slide down a wire like a zip line until they were around 1 kilometer away from the failing rocket and launch pad. They would also train to fly the rocket with a shuttle simulator in the KSC, or Kennedy Space Center. It was a hyper-accurate model, or simulator, which would be used to train the whole crew. They would also go into zero-G planes to practice doing things in zero-G. The plane would get to a high enough altitude and then nosedive out of the sky, which would send the plane to freefall. Because zero-G isn't no gravity, it's freefall. Because when you're in orbit, you're going so fast that you just keep missing the planet. And while you're in orbit and high enough in the atmosphere, there's no atmosphere drag or air resistance. So you can stay up there for a while being weightless. But there isn't much else to talk about the training, so let's get into the next segment of the video. Each mission for the space shuttle would be different. They would either collect data from asteroids, dock with the ISS, collect zero-G data, and many more classified things. So NASA would begin filling the large external tank with LOX and liquid hydrogen around 6 hours before liftoff. Then they would complete the fuel loading around 30 minutes later. Crews would get the fuel into a stable state, and then the crews would arrive at the pad again. At T-minus 3 hours, they would have an expected hold, which would usually last around 2 hours or 2.5 hours. During the hold, they would advise the crew about the weather, the closeout crew arrives at the pad, and many other checks are done. Then after the hold, the crews begin their way to the pad. They board the shuttle around 2 hours before liftoff, and then after that, the hatch is closed and the crews evacuate the pad. Then at T-minus 20 minutes, they have an expected hold, which lasts around 10 minutes for small checks. But then they continue with the countdown. At T-minus 9 minutes, they will hold for the final time, making the final system checks. The hold length will usually be around 5 minutes, but not much longer. Then at T-minus 30 seconds, the sound suppression system will begin to start up. The sound suppression system dumps 500,000 pounds of water onto the launch pad to dampen the rocket sound. Then at T-minus 10 seconds, the rofies will ignite to burn the excess hydrogen produced by the engines. Then at T-minus 6.6 seconds, all 3 RS-25 engines will ignite and slowly ramp up to full power. Then at T0, the SRBs will ignite and the launch clamps will release. The LOX arm will fall away from the rocket, and then they will have liftoff. At around 1 minute 30 seconds into the flight, the 2 side strap-on SRBs will burn out, and then they will be jettisoned seconds later. And at around 8.5 minutes after liftoff, the main engines will cut off as the external tank is done, empty, and they're almost in orbit. The external tank will be jettisoned, and then the OMS thrusters will fire for 2 continuous minutes, and then the shuttle's in orbit. There were many different shuttles. There was an expected fleet of 4 shuttles. There were 6 in total, 5 which flew to space, and 3 which are in museums today. The 6 total ones were Atlantis, Discovery, Endeavour, Columbia, Challenger, and Enterprise. The 5 to fly were Atlantis, Discovery, Endeavour, Columbia, and Challenger. Enterprise was just a training vehicle. Atlantis flew 33 times in total, Discovery flew 39 times, Endeavour flew 25 times, Columbia flew 28, and Challenger flew 9. There were 2 orbiters lost in the shuttle program. The first was the Challenger in 1986, which carried the crew of 7. And the last disaster was in 2003, where the shuttle Columbia broke up during its re-entry portion of the flight. Endeavour was made to replace Challenger after it exploded, but Columbia broke up too far into the program that it didn't get replaced. The final answer is just 2 words: solid fuel. The reason it was so dangerous is because of the 2 side strap-on SRBs. They got rid of any possible abort possibilities in the first 2 minutes into the flight. The SRBs also couldn't get shut down once ignited, so once they ignited, you were going into space, and you were going very fast. Also, the SRB fumes are toxic, so you can't eject from the shuttle, as you would die from the poisoning from the exhaust. So that's why the shuttle was dangerous. Thank you guys for watching. I spent days researching and writing and recording this video, so I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.